Just a few years ago, we were getting reports about hundreds of EV makers in China with new technologies and ambitions to take over the global market. Today, the reality is much different, as it has become obvious that there isn't enough room for all of them. The market is oversaturated, there isn't enough capital for everyone, while the ongoing price war made things even more complicated. Stay with us to find out why Chinese EV makers are going bankrupt, leaving huge EV graveyards behind. Number 5. EV graveyards all around China. One of the most interesting things we've been witnessing in China lately is the so-called EV graveyards. Pretty much every bigger city has one of these, with hundreds, if not thousands, of abandoned EVs. What's particularly interesting is that all of these vehicles have license plates, meaning that at some point they were bought and registered. How did they end up like this? It's a bit of a mystery, but many experts think it's some kind of a scheme, considering that the vast majority of these abandoned EVs were purchased by car-sharing companies. It all started 2 decades ago, when the Chinese government decided to invest billions in so-called new energy vehicles. Vehicles that would run on alternative sources of energy, such as hybrids, plug-in hybrids, EVs, and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. By the end of that first decade of the 21st century, when it became clear that EVs are the only way to catch up with Western legacy car makers, the government started pouring even more money into startup companies. Eventually, the large number of EV makers rose to 500. It was obvious that such a state couldn't last for so long, especially after authorities started imposing stricter conditions for incentives. Of course, the key condition was to start selling vehicles in certain volumes, but that was anything but easy to achieve. All these small startup companies with limited capital were desperate to figure out new ways to get much-needed subsidies. That's the main indicator of an organized scheme. Many believe that these companies were selling EVs only to ensure incentives, while car-sharing companies never had serious intentions to use them regularly. And while many claim that this was a scheme to get subsidies from the government, others like to point out that most of these graveyards are full of older first-generation electric vehicles that were never able to compete in terms of technology and quality, and that all of this is a natural process, where most startups end up either in bankruptcy or being purchased by a bigger player. Number 4. 90% of EV companies practically do not exist anymore. China's aim to become a global leader in EV technology opened up so many possibilities for startup companies. Eventually, the number of EV makers went up to 500 in 2018, and it was pretty clear that even the Chinese economy, as huge as it is, can't support all of them if they don't sell at least some of those EVs. Most companies managed to gain technologies and establish production facilities, but when it was time to start making vehicles in volumes, they ran out of money. And then, COVID-19 happened, and an economic crisis followed. It was clear that there was not enough room for all those companies. According to last year's reports, the number of EV makers went down significantly. Officially, it's under 100, but experts suspect that the actual number of those who produce and sell EVs is much smaller, and that many more companies will end their businesses in the near future. Because to survive, you need fresh capital, and to get fresh capital, you need sales numbers. The problem is that most of these companies never reached decent sales volumes. Many of them remained at the level of 500 units quarterly, which definitely isn't a number that could attract new investors. That's why those estimations that only around 50 out of 500 companies still operate make sense. 90% of the companies practically don't exist anymore, but it's just a matter of time before all those walking dead officially declare bankruptcy and the practical number also becomes official. Number 3. Recent wave of bankruptcy. The wave of bankruptcy we've been witnessing in the last couple of months is probably the best indicator that Chinese EV companies are in big trouble. Just in the last few months, we saw 5 Chinese companies declaring bankruptcy, with some of them being considered quite prospective until not so long ago. The problem is, as we've already mentioned, that the market isn't large enough for all of them. If you look at the Chinese car market in EV sales, it turns out that 80% of total sales are held by the top 10 EV manufacturers. It's only around 20% that belongs to the rest of the pack, so the data we've just mentioned doesn't surprise at all. According to some research, 1/3 of the currently active EV makers sell more than 2,000 vehicles annually. So, it's easy to assume that most of them will sooner or later end their business. Experts suggest that there are at least 20 more companies to declare bankruptcy this year. Among the companies that recently declared bankruptcy are quite some prospective names, as mentioned. For example, there's a company called Ledin, which was even considered to be ahead of Tesla in terms of sales numbers 8 or 9 years ago. Neutron also went into bankruptcy, just like Evergrande New Energy Auto, a company that's part of a Chinese conglomerate that invested billions in electric vehicles. But despite the massive investments, it never managed to make any decent sales numbers, which caused a monumental loss of $17 million on every EV sold. Finally, let's not forget the WM, one of the most recent cases of bankruptcy. Once again, we're talking about an EV maker that seemed quite promising, especially if we consider it one of the startups with the largest capital, estimated at $5.3 billion. But despite some pretty respectable technological achievements, WM was never able to compete in this price war and cover big losses. The company is currently in a massive restructuring process and in a quest for new investors, but things don't look promising at all. Number 2, even big players are questionable. With the ongoing price war and other challenges of the super competitive Chinese EV market, the fall of all those startups doesn't surprise at all. But what's a little surprising is that even the big players have trouble keeping up with the competition. Even among the top 10 makers, there's a lot of struggle, because it's not easy to make a profit on EVs, even with high volume sales. Practically, BYD is the only Chinese car maker that makes money on EVs. Moreover, BYD and Tesla are currently the only 2 companies that make a profit on EVs in the entire world. Other major car makers from China struggle to crack the EV economy despite the generous government incentives and low labor costs. They're all losing money, including companies like NIO. This company already established pretty impressive production facilities and currently employs more than 11,000 people, but sales are anything but good, considering that NIO managed to sell just 8,000 last year, losing around $35,000 on each electric vehicle, which is on par with Western legacy car makers like Ford. With that in mind, it doesn't surprise that companies like NIO are looking for financial injections all around the world, including one from Abu Dhabi for a 7% stake in return. Other major players, including Chinese legacy car companies, are struggling with the EV economy, and for them, the only mitigating circumstance is that they have the capacity to compete internationally in various markets around the world, which leads us to the number 1 reason why so many Chinese companies are failing. Number 1, domestic market limitation. Probably the main reason why so many EV makers went into bankruptcy is the fact that the Chinese domestic market has so many limitations. China may be a huge market, but isn't exactly crowded with wealthy households. Instead, most Chinese people can't afford expensive cars, so companies are forced to put everything on small and cheap EVs. The problem is that even if profitable, the margins are minimal in this class of vehicles, which means that only a few car makers will be able to survive the ongoing price war. Most others will go into bankruptcy or end up acquired by some of the bigger players. As mentioned, BYD and Tesla are probably the only EV companies that count on EV profit. Besides them, there are a few more legacy car makers that can survive because these companies don't depend on the domestic market only. There are companies like Geely or MG with a strong presence in various markets around the world. These two companies have been selling cars in various international markets for years and already establish a position of affordable alternatives to Western car makers. In those markets, they can offer competitive prices, whether it's about electric or traditional internal combustion-powered models, and compensate for the losses they are and will be making domestically. So what we're witnessing now is a complete change in the Chinese EV market landscape. The era of diversity has come to an end. New technologies have been gained, and now it's time for the big ones to benefit. In other words, the number of Chinese EV companies will continue to fall and probably won't stop until there are just a few major players left. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.